As she approached the climax of this section, the intensity of the music increased. The chords resonated powerfully, filling the hall with energy. The audience responded instinctively, leaning forward, holding their breath, and becoming part of the music itself. The young woman played with skill, passion, and precision, guiding the listeners through the emotional peaks and valleys of the piece. The room was transformed, alive with attention, admiration, and awe. The performance had reached a point where every listener was fully engaged. Those who had come with low expectations were now captivated. Skeptics had been silenced, replaced with admiration and respect. The young woman had not only displayed technical mastery, but had conveyed emotion, courage, and authenticity in every note. The music had become a shared experience, a moment that would remain in the memories of everyone present long after the final note faded. She allowed the music to soften, to breathe, and to linger. The audience absorbed every subtle nuance, every gentle pause, every delicate touch. The hall seemed to exist in a suspended state, a quiet space where emotion, attention, and music converged. Each listener experienced the performance in their own way, yet all were united by the beauty, honesty, and depth of expression she conveyed, even as the performance continued. The young woman felt a sense of calm and accomplishment. She had transformed her nerves and anticipation into focus and expression. The music had become a part of her, and she had become a part of the music. The audience was not merely observing. They were participating, experiencing, and feeling the story she was telling. It was a rare and profound connection, one that transcended ordinary performance. As the section neared its conclusion, the young woman's playing became more delicate and nuanced. The notes floated through the hall, echoing gently and resonating with emotion. The audience remained still, captivated, as if afraid to disturb the fragile beauty of the moment. She allowed the music to speak for itself, confident that the honesty and depth of her expression would leave a lasting impact. The room was transformed, no longer a simple recital hall, but a space of shared emotion, understanding, and awe. As the young woman played the final notes of her piece, the hall remained silent for a long moment. It was as if time itself had paused to honor the conclusion of something extraordinary. The music lingered in the air, soft vibrations that held the audience captive even as the last chord faded. She let her hands rest gently on the keys, allowing the final resonance to settle, and then slowly lifted them. The room seemed to breathe collectively, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had all experienced together. As she approached the climax of this section, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of the emotion she had carried for so long. The powerful chords resonated through the hall, filling every corner with sound. The audience responded instinctively, leaning forward, holding their breath, and becoming part of the music itself. The young woman played with precision and feeling, guiding the listeners through the emotional peaks and valleys with skill and sensitivity. The room was transformed. What had begun as a simple recital for an open audience had become an immersive experience, a moment of shared emotion and understanding. Those who had expected nothing were now captivated, and those who had come with preconceived notions of talent and skill were humbled by the depth of expression before them. The music had become a bridge, connecting the performer to the audience in a profound and unforgettable way. She allowed a few moments of silence between passages, letting the notes linger, echo, and settle in the minds and hearts of the listeners. The pauses were intentional, providing space for reflection, absorption, and anticipation. Each breath, each gesture, each subtle shift in dynamics contributed to the overall effect, creating a performance that was both technically impressive and deeply moving. From the back of the hall, a whisper traveled. "I can't believe she's only starting. This is incredible." Others nodded, murmuring agreement, unable to tear their eyes away from the piano. The young woman continued, aware of their presence but not distracted, letting the music guide her and allowing her emotions to flow freely through the performance. As the section came to a gentle close, she felt a sense of accomplishment and calm. The audience remained still for a moment, processing what they had heard. The young woman's performance had shifted their expectations, placed doubt with admiration, and transformed ordinary curiosity into deep respect. She had not only played the piano, she had shared a piece of herself, and in doing so, she had created a memory that would stay with the listeners long after the final note faded. It was a reminder that talent, passion, and honesty could break through assumptions and leave an indelible mark on those willing to listen. The young woman felt the music carrying her forward, guiding her hands, her mind, and her heart. Every note resonated with the energy of the hall, with the audience's attention. With the countless hours she had spent perfecting each passage, she was no longer thinking about herself or the nervous anticipation that had accompanied her arrival. She was fully immersed in the flow, and the room seemed to flow with her. The audience had become quiet, completely absorbed. Conversations, whispers, and restless movements had vanished. People sat in rapt attention, leaning slightly forward as if drawn closer by an invisible force. Some faces showed astonishment, others a quiet joy, and some betrayed an unexpected emotion tears, welling silently in response to the delicate touch of her hands on the keys. Each note spoke to them, and each pause gave them time to feel, reflect, and absorb the experience. She transitioned into a complex section of the piece that demanded both precision and emotional depth. Her fingers moved effortlessly, yet with complete control. Every chord, every scale, every shift in tempo was executed with care. She had practiced this section countless times, but now it was alive. Infused with the energy of the room and the audience's engagement, the performance had evolved from a personal endeavor into a shared experience. A moment that connected her and every listener in a way that transcended words. The judge leaned forward in his seat, captivated. He had observed many performers, but very few had the ability to convey both technical mastery and raw emotion so effortlessly. He scribbled notes quickly, but his focus was on understanding the essence of what was happening before him. He watched her hands, her expressions, the subtle gestures that revealed her connection with the music. There was no doubt now that she was exceptional. It was not simply talent. It was dedication, courage, and honesty woven into every note. A woman near the front row whispered to her companion, "I have never heard anything like this." The companion nodded silently, holding back words, captivated by the performance. The young woman had transcended the expectation of the audience. She had turned a quiet recital into a profound emotional journey. The room, once filled with casual chatter and low expectations, had been transformed into a space of shared wonder and appreciation. The music swelled and softened in waves. Each section a delicate conversation between the performer and the listeners. The soft passages invited reflection, while the louder moments demanded attention, commanding the room with their intensity. She had learned to use the piano as an extension of herself, each note a reflection of her inner thoughts, her emotions, and her dedication. The audience was responding, not consciously but instinctively, drawn into the rhythm and emotion of the piece. She noticed subtle changes in the audience's expressions. Children leaned forward, fascinated by the sound. Adults closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. A few people had tears glistening on their cheeks, moved by the sincerity and beauty of the performance. The energy in the room was palpable, a collective acknowledgement of the power and authenticity of what they were witnessing. She felt their attention as a gentle presence, supporting her, guiding her, and encouraging her to express herself fully. Her fingers danced over the keys, navigating complex passages with ease. The transitions between sections were seamless, the flow of the music continuous and natural. Every note carried meaning, every pause was intentional. The performance was no longer about skill alone. It was about storytelling, about conveying emotion through sound. She had learned to communicate without words, and the audience was responding to the honesty of her expression. A man in the middle rows leaned closer to his companion, whispering in disbelief, "She's extraordinary." The companion's eyes were fixed on the piano, unable to speak. Every listener had become part of the experience, even if silently. The young woman had managed to turn her personal journey of practice and perseverance into a shared moment of beauty and emotion. The room was alive, connected through the language of music. The piece entered a delicate and introspective section. Soft notes floated through the hall, echoing gently against the walls. She allowed the music to breathe, to linger, to resonate. The audience leaned in, listening attentively, feeling the subtle shifts in tone and expression. Each note was a story, each pause a moment of reflection. The hall seemed to hold its breath, hanging on every sound, every gentle movement of her hands. Even the performers who had previously whispered doubts now sat silently, captivated by the display of skill and emotion. One of them muttered softly, "I never expected this," while another simply shook their head, eyes wide in admiration. The young woman's performance had defied their assumptions, challenging their expectations with honesty and talent. The room had become a space where judgment and skepticism gave way to wonder and appreciation. The judge observed her intently, noting the subtle nuances of her technique and the depth of her expression. He had seen many accomplished performers, but few could combine technical mastery with emotional resonance so completely. The young woman had an ability to tell a story through her playing, to convey feelings and experiences that words could not capture. Her performance was a rare blend of skill, emotion, and authenticity that left a lasting impression on everyone present. She moved into a more powerful and dramatic section of the piece, her fingers striking the keys with precision and force. The room responded instinctively, the audience leaning forward, holding their breath, becoming part of the performance. The contrast between the soft, intimate passages and the bold, commanding sections highlighted her mastery of dynamics and emotion. She was not performing for applause or recognition. She was performing to share a story, and the audience was fully engaged, experiencing every moment alongside her. The energy in the hall was palpable. People sat in awe, completely absorbed, unable to look away. Faces reflected concentration, wonder, and even tears. The young woman had created an immersive experience, a connection that transcended age, background, and expectation. She had transformed an ordinary recital into a moment of shared emotion and understanding. The audience, who had expected nothing, was now captivated and inspired. Her hands moved gracefully, each note precise yet full of feeling. She allowed the music to guide her, to flow naturally from her mind and heart into the piano. Every chord, every scale, every subtle shift in tempo was intentional. The performance had become a dialogue between her and the audience, a conversation conducted without words, where emotion and expression spoke louder than any language. The room responded, united by the beauty and honesty of the music. A young girl whispered to her mother, "It's amazing." The mother nodded silently, eyes fixed on the piano. People were experiencing the performance in their own ways, yet all were connected by the shared appreciation of her skill and emotion. The young woman had created a space where listeners could feel, reflect, and be moved. The music had become a bridge, linking hearts and minds through the universal language of sound. She was aware of the silence that had fallen over the hall. It was not oppressive. It was respectful, filled with attention and expectation. No one whispered. No one shifted unnecessarily. The only sounds were the music, the soft echo of the piano, and the subtle breathing of the captivated audience. She felt the weight of that silence, but it did not intimidate her. Instead, it gave her a sense of partnership, a realization that the room itself was becoming part of the performance, listening, responding, and participating in a way that would leave a lasting impression. The piece reached a delicate passage, soft and intimate, requiring careful touch and patience. Her hands moved with gentle precision, and she could see subtle reactions across the room. A tear glistened in the eye of an elderly woman near the front. A young man's brow furrowed in concentration, a child's mouth slightly open in awe. Each reaction, though unnoticed by most, fueled her determination to convey the full depth of emotion embedded in the music. She was not performing for applause. She was performing to share, to express, to connect. As she transitioned to a more powerful section, the room held its breath again. The music swelled, filling every corner of the hall. People shifted in their seats, their attention unwavering, as if physically tethered to the rhythm and flow. The contrast between soft intimacy and bold strength highlighted her skill. Yes, but more importantly, it highlighted her understanding of the music. Her ability to guide the audience through a journey that felt personal and universal at the same time. With each passing moment, the young woman became more immersed, more present. She no longer noticed the judge, the performers, or the audience individually. She noticed only the collective experience, the invisible thread connecting her to every listener. Every key she pressed, every chord she formed, every pause she allowed carried intention. The room responded not just with polite attention, but with recognition of something rare and genuine. The performance was no longer hers alone. As the music continued to fill the hall, the young woman felt a new kind of focus settling in. It was no longer about nerves or proving herself. Each note became a bridge, connecting her to the listeners in a way that felt immediate and real. She could sense their attention, their quiet admiration, and their growing awe. The room had shifted. It was no longer a collection of strangers, but a space alive with shared emotion and anticipation. Her hands moved gracefully across the keys, flowing from one chord to another with precision and care. The tempo changed subtly, allowing for moments of reflection and pauses that seemed to hang in the air, making the audience lean in, hanging on each sound. She could feel the rhythm not just in her fingers, but in her entire body, as if the music had become part of her and she a part of it. The audience, sensing this connection, remained still, completely absorbed. People who had come with low expectations now found themselves captivated. A man sitting near the center leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand, eyes wide with wonder. A young woman in the front row covered her mouth with her fingers, unable to contain her amazement. Even the staff who had been busy with small tasks stopped, quietly listening, drawn into the world she was creating. There was no whispering, no fidgeting, just the pure, shared experience of the music. She entered a section of the piece that demanded both technical skill and emotional depth. The keys responded to her touch as if anticipating her intent. Her fingers flew across the piano with controlled speed, each movement deliberate, each note carefully placed. She had practiced this passage countless times, yet in this moment, it was alive, dynamic, infused with the energy of the room and her own passion. The power of the music was undeniable. She could sense the room holding its collective breath. A few performers who had once whispered doubts to each other now sat in silence, unable to look away. One muttered softly, "How's she doing this?" Another simply shook their head, mesmerized. They had expected a simple performance, maybe a modest attempt. What they were witnessing now was a revelation. Every chord, every crescendo, every subtle nuance told a story of dedication, talent, and the quiet courage of someone who had worked tirelessly without recognition. She felt the emotion in the piece swell within her. The softer notes allowed for introspection, the louder ones for release. She controlled each shift, guiding the audience through a journey that was as much about feeling as about sound. The music seemed to breathe, and the room breathed with it. Even those who did not understand every technical aspect of the performance felt its impact. They were experiencing something rare, something beautiful, something honest. From the back of the hall, a whisper traveled softly between two listeners. "She's incredible." Another simply nodded, tears forming in her eyes. People were beginning to realize that this was more than a performance. It was an expression of life, of struggle, of triumph, and of unspoken emotions that everyone could relate to. The young woman played not for recognition, but to share a piece of herself, and in doing so, she had captured the hearts of those around her. The judge, who had been silent for much of the performance, scribbled notes furiously. But his writing was not for criticism alone. It was a record of astonishment, an attempt to capture the depth of the experience. He had seen many performers, yet few had managed to convey such honesty and skill. He looked up again, focusing on her hands, the subtle movements, the delicate expression of emotion that spoke louder than any words could. There was mastery here, yes, but also humanity's, something rare and compelling. As the piece progressed, she felt herself becoming completely immersed. Time seemed to stretch, elongating the music and the moments within it. She no longer thought about the audience, the room, or herself. There was only the piano, the notes, and the flow of the story she was telling. Every rise and fall of the melody was intentional, every pause calculated to allow the audience to feel and absorb. She had learned this balance through countless hours of practice, but it was now enhanced by instinct and emotion. A child in the front row leaned forward, eyes wide, whispering to their parent, "It's so beautiful." The parent nodded, holding the child close, both fully absorbed. The music had transcended age, background, and expectation. It had become something universal, something that everyone could feel in their own way. The young woman, sensing this, allowed herself a subtle smile. She had not intended to astonish anyone, yet she had achieved it through the honesty of her expression. The room seemed to hum with quiet energy. Even the walls appeared to absorb the sound, reflecting it back in a way that made the space feel alive. Each listener was affected differently, but the common thread was undeniable: attention, admiration, and a growing sense of awe. Those who had come expecting nothing were now witnesses to something extraordinary. The young woman's skill, dedication, emotion had transformed the ordinary into the unforgettable. She moved into a slower, more reflective section of the piece. The notes were soft, deliberate, and full of feeling. Her fingers lingered on certain keys, allowing the sound to resonate, to echo, to fill the space. The audience leaned in, feeling each vibration, each subtle shift. It was as if the room itself had paused to listen, to experience the story she was telling without words. Every gesture, every expression, every nuance was part of the narrative. A man whispered to his neighbor, "I didn't think anyone could play like this." His neighbor simply nodded, too entranced to speak. Others shared similar reactions, silent expressions of amazement. The young woman had managed to capture something intangible, something that could not be taught or forced. It was a combination of talent, hard work, and the courage to express herself fully. And it resonated deeply with everyone present. She continued, moving seamlessly from soft, introspective passages to more intense, dramatic moments. Each transition was smooth, each variation purposeful. The audience followed her effortlessly, carried along by the music's ebb and flow. There was no distraction, no impatience. Everyone was engaged, fully present, and emotionally invested. The power of the performance lay not in showiness or theatrics, but in the authenticity of her expression, in the way she allowed the music to speak for her. The judge looked up from his notes again, now fully attentive. He observed her technique, the subtle shifts in dynamics and the fluidity of her movements. But more than that, he observed the emotion, the connection between the performer and the audience, the ability to communicate without words. This was a rare talent, one that could inspire, move, and leave a lasting impression. He recognized the significance of what he was witnessing and allowed himself a moment to simply watch, to absorb the beauty of the performance. She sensed the audience's reactions, subtle yet powerful. People shifted in their seats, leaning forward, holding their breath, and relaxing only when the music softened. Faces reflected concentration, wonder, and even tears. She had managed to create an intimate experience in a public space, a connection that transcended words. The music had become a shared journey, a story being told collectively, where each listener experienced it in their own unique way. In those initial moments, she felt a strange combination of liberation and focus. Each note flowed naturally, each chord resonated deeply, and with every measure, her confidence grew. The people who had doubted, who had glanced with amusement, began to sense the depth of what they were hearing. It was not just music, it was a story, a reflection of countless nights of effort, a channel for emotions too complex for words alone. And she played not for them, but with them, inviting the room into a space where nothing else existed except the music and the shared experience it created. Every subtle variation, every gentle pause, every delicate touch was intentional, a careful expression of emotion and skill. She allowed herself to be carried by the music, to lose herself in the melody she had lived with for so long. The audience remained unaware of the full story, but their senses responded instinctively. The quiet moments drew them in, the louder passages held their attention, and the shifts in tempo reflected the ebb and flow of life itself. She played not to be seen, but to be felt. That distinction made every note more powerful, every phrase more authentic, every silence more profound. As she continued, as she finished the first part of her piece, a small ripple of attention began to spread across the room. People who had been casually chatting or adjusting their seats turned their heads, realizing that something different was happening. The young woman felt a surge of quiet confidence. She did not need to speak to anyone, smile, or show off. The music carried everything she wanted to express. She could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the subtle change from casual disinterest to focused listening. Behind the rows of seats, a few performers who had already played leaned forward. Their initial amusement faded into curiosity. One of them whispered to a friend, "Did she just?" and then stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. The friends shook their heads slightly, eyes widening. They had expected nothing, but now they were being forced to pay attention. It was not showy. It was not loud. It was pure, precise, and undeniably skillful. She continued playing, her hands moving with both control and freedom, each note deliberate, yet flowing naturally. Her heart pounded, but not from fear. It was from the energy of the music itself, the way it demanded her complete attention while simultaneously releasing her from every other worry. Each chord, each delicate pause, drew the listeners deeper into the performance. Some leaned closer in their chairs, as if the sound alone could pull them physically toward the piano. A few faces in the audience were harder to read. One man furrowed his brow, as if struggling to comprehend how such depth and clarity could come from someone so seemingly ordinary. A young woman tucked her hair behind her ear, eyes fixed on the pianist, jaw slightly open, captivated by the emotion in the music. Children, who had been restless now, sat quietly, mesmerized by the flow of notes that seemed to tell a story they could almost understand without words. The judge at the front of the room had initially been distracted, flipping through a notebook and checking the time. But now he straightened in his chair. His hand paused over his pen. He leaned forward, watching the pianist's hands as they danced across the keys. The subtle expressions, the timing, the intensity. It was clear that this performance was not simply the product of practice. It was a conversation with the music itself, a dialogue that demanded the audience's attention. She noticed the change too. The nervous tension that had been quietly building in the room began to dissipate, replaced by anticipation. Every note she played carried the weight of her preparation and the honesty of her emotions. There was a confidence that came from knowing she had poured her soul into the music, not for applause or recognition, but because it was the truth of her experience. And as she played, the room recognized that truth, even if only subconsciously. A whisper traveled through the audience. Not loud enough to disturb the music, but enough that a ripple of acknowledgement spread. People shifted in their seats, adjusting their posture to listen more carefully. Eyes widened, brows raised, and a few people held their hands to their mouths in awe. She could sense the subtle energy in the room, the invisible threads of curiosity, amazement, and wonder beginning to weave around her. She had expected nerves. She had not expected to feel this power, this immediate connection with strangers who would soon be witnesses to her passion. As the piece progressed, she allowed herself to breathe with the music. Her movements were smooth, almost instinctive, yet deliberate in every detail. She did not rush, did not try to impress with extra flourishes or dramatic gestures. Every note was intentional, carrying the emotion she wanted to convey. The gentle rise and fall of the melody mirrored the rhythm of her own heartbeat, creating a connection not only with the piano, but with the listeners, who were slowly becoming part of the performance itself. From the back of the hall, a woman whispered to her companion, "She's incredible." Companion simply nodded, unable to speak as the music held them captive. It was not just technical skill. It was the emotion behind it, the depth, the honesty, the story embedded in every phrase. The young woman could feel that they were listening, really listening, and it encouraged her to pour even more of herself into the music. She remembered the long nights of practice, the aching fingers, the frustration when a passage refused to flow, and the joy when finally it worked. Every challenge she had faced contributed to this moment. Every hour spent in silence, every sacrifice, every small victory, it all converged now in the sound resonating from the piano. She played not to impress, not to compete, but to express, to share something that words could never capture. That was why the room was starting to change. Why the faces she saw reflected a growing awe and respect. A small child in the front row tugged at her parent's sleeve, whispering, "Listen to that." The parent smiled softly, nodding, but even they were caught up in the spell of the performance. People who had arrived late and were finding seats stopped moving. Even the hall's staff, busy with lights and adjustments, paused to listen. The music had reached beyond the boundaries of expectation, beyond the casual assumptions of the audience. It demanded attention because it was real, it was heartfelt, and it carried the weight of someone's entire journey. The young woman could feel herself entering a different state of awareness. She was no longer conscious of the room, the people, or even the nerves she had carried. She was only aware of the music and the way it wanted to flow. Her hands moved with precision and fluidity, guided by years of preparation but inspired by the emotions she had kept inside for too long. Each note was a thread, each phrase a connection, and the room became a tapestry of shared experience. She was telling a story without words, and everyone present, even if silently, was beginning to understand. A few performers who had once been amused by her quiet presence now sat rigidly, almost afraid to move, afraid to disturb the delicate magic being created. One of them whispered, "I didn't expect this. I didn't think she could play like this." Another simply nodded, unable to find words. The audience was captivated, not by spectacle, but by authenticity. It was a rare moment when skill and emotion combined so perfectly that the room could feel it collectively. The judge scribbled notes quickly now, but even his focus was not on critiquing. He was observing, listening, and learning. The quiet force of her performance demanded recognition not through commentary, but through presence. His pen moved across the page, capturing impressions, but it could not capture the essence of what was unfolding. He looked up occasionally, meeting her hands on the keys, the way her expression shifted subtly with the music. He recognized mastery, yes, but more importantly, he recognized honesty and courage. She could sense a slight shift in the audience's breathing. People leaned forward without realizing it, drawn in by the subtleties, the small nuances, the raw emotion carried in each chord. It was not just technical skill that held them. It was the vulnerability, the willingness to share something personal and unguarded. Her music had become a bridge, connecting her private world with the hearts and minds of strangers, who were listening more attentively than she could have imagined. The notes began to flow faster, more intense, yet every movement remained controlled. She felt a thrill in the challenge, a thrill in the dialogue she was having with the piano and indirectly with the audience. There was a silent conversation, a mutual understanding developing without words. The room was alive, transformed by the honesty of her performance, by the care and dedication infused into every measure. Even the skeptics, those who had expected nothing, found themselves caught in the spell. A man sitting near the middle row whispered to his neighbor, "I can't believe this is her first time here." The neighbor's eyes were wide, fixed on the pianist, and they shook their heads slightly in disbelief. Every note she played seemed to carry experience far beyond what one could expect from a single performance. It was as if the music itself had absorbed years of quiet practice, careful observation, and relentless effort, and now spoke with clarity and authority. The young woman walked slowly through the doors of the small music hall. It was a warm evening outside, but inside the hall, the air carried a quiet tension. People were chatting in small groups, tuning their instruments, or practicing last-minute pieces on the pianos scattered around the room. She carried no instrument with her. All she had was a small bag with sheet music she had memorized so many times that she no longer needed it. She moved quietly, almost as if she didn't want anyone to notice her. But in a room full of music lovers, there were already eyes that followed her. She felt them, though she tried not to. Most of the other performers were dressed sharply, their confidence radiating in every step. They joked with friends, laughed at mistakes, and gave each other encouraging pats on the back. They seemed so sure of themselves. She, on the other hand, felt a strange mix of nerves and determination. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the straps of her bag, trying to ignore the tiny voice in her head that whispered doubts. It was not that she doubted her ability to play. She had played this piece hundreds of times in empty rooms in her tiny apartment, late at night when the world was asleep. The doubt came from somewhere else, from the feeling that nobody would see her the way she really was. She found a quiet corner at the back of the hall and sat down. From there, she could see the stage, the piano, and the small audience gathering. Most people were there to watch their friends or family, not to discover a new talent. Some faces were already turning toward the stage with expectation, while others seemed to be glancing around, waiting for something interesting to happen. She studied them quietly, noticing the smiles, the casual gestures, the restless children, the people sipping water or coffee, and the ones scribbling notes in small books. It was a crowd like any other, full of curiosity and little pretension, yet none of them knew what was about to happen. She had signed up for the open recital just 2 days ago. It was impulsive, really, driven by a mix of longing and necessity. She had needed a reason to perform, a place to let the music breathe outside her apartment walls. She had spent the last several weeks preparing, focusing on a single piece that she knew would challenge her in ways nothing else could. Every note, every pause, every subtle touch had been practiced until it could almost play itself. Yet now, standing at the back of the room, she felt a knot in her stomach. The room was filled with casual chatter, the occasional click of a camera, the soft echo of footsteps. It was normal, ordinary, mundane, and she wondered if she would be lost among all that ordinariness. She glanced around again and noticed a group of people laughing quietly near the piano. They were performers who had already played earlier. She tried not to let it bother her, but she saw the amused glances they threw in her direction. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She realized they did not expect much from someone like her. She wore plain clothes, her hair tied back simply, and she carried no signs of extravagant talent or confidence. In that moment, she felt a flicker of something strange, half defiance. If they did not expect her to do anything impressive, perhaps it would be easier to surprise them. Perhaps it would be easier to let her music speak before anyone could judge her face, her appearance, or her quiet demeanor. She reached into her bag and pulled out the small notebook where she had written her notes about the piece. Not the sheet music itself, she didn't need it, but the little reminders about expression, timing, and emotions. She read through them silently, letting the words sink in. Each instruction was like a gentle nudge from herself to herself, a way of saying, "You know what to do. You can do this." She had done this countless times before, but today it felt different. Today, it was not just practice. It was a test, a chance to put all those late nights, all that silent dedication, into something real. Something others could see and feel. People continued to move around the room. A few performers were finishing their warm-ups, the sound of scales echoing softly against the walls. The audience murmured, settling into their seats, some chatting, some silently watching. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the familiar calm wash over her. She thought about the many nights she had spent alone, the hours of repetition, the aching fingers, and the quiet triumphs when a particularly difficult passage finally fell into place. It all led here, to this small hall, to this moment where she was just another performer. And yet in some way, she was on the verge of something remarkable. A friendly voice interrupted her thoughts. One of the volunteers approached, checking names off the list. "You're next," the volunteer said with a smile. She nodded, her throat tight, her palms sweaty, but her heart steady. She gathered her music and rose slowly, feeling the weight of anticipation settle over her like a gentle pressure. Walking toward the stage, each step seemed heavier than the last, but also more purposeful. The audience didn't notice her yet, or maybe they did and did not care. Either way, she moved forward, ready to transform the invisible hours of practice into audible art. The piano on the stage gleamed under the soft lights. its black and white keys clean and inviting. She stood beside it for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the edge. She took in the room again. Faces, chairs, walls, they all faded into the background as she focused on the instrument in front of her. It had been a long journey to this point, one filled with quiet dedication, hope and frustration, with moments of joy and doubt. And now, all that remained was the music itself. She adjusted the bench, settled her feet, and let her hands hover above the keys. The room was filled with the quiet hum of anticipation, though no one yet realized how powerful the silence would become once she began. In her mind, she reviewed the piece one last time, each movement, each shift in tempo, each subtle change in dynamics. She had learned to feel the music in her body, not just in her fingers. She had learned to breathe with it, to let it carry her emotions and experiences into something that could be shared with others. She reminded herself that she did not need to impress anyone with a flashy performance or showy gestures. The truth of the music, the honesty of the notes, would speak for itself. It had to. That was her gift, and it was time to give it away. She looked out into the audience. For the first time, she noticed the casual smiles and small nods of recognition. A few people whispered to one another, perhaps thinking she was just another performer who would fade into the background. She allowed herself a tiny smile, a spark of quiet mischief. Let them think what they want. Let them underestimate her. The music would reveal the truth far more clearly than any words ever could. A deep breath. Her fingers touched the keys lightly, testing the resistance, feeling the smooth surface beneath her fingertips. The hall seemed to hold its breath with her. There was no rush, no urgency, just the anticipation of what was to come. She let her mind go still, focusing solely on the rhythm, the melody, the emotion that had lived inside her for so long. The first note would not just be a sound, it would be a statement, a declaration of everything she had worked for. Every quiet hour of effort and determination, she noticed a few people shifting in their seats. Curiosity piqued. Perhaps the contrast between her quiet demeanor and the confident performers before her created a subtle tension. Perhaps they wondered if she could even play. That thought might have been discouraging for someone else, but for her, it fueled a quiet fire. There was nothing to prove to anyone except to herself. And yet, as the first notes emerged, those doubts would vanish. The music had a way of speaking that went beyond expectation or judgment. It had a power all its own. She positioned her hands over the keys, feeling the familiar weight of the piano beneath her fingers. She closed her eyes briefly, imagining the notes as they would flow, imagining the expressions, the pauses, the crescendos and decrescendos that would carry the audience through a journey she had known intimately for months. She imagined their faces, their reactions, the quiet shifts as they listened more closely than they ever had before. She could sense the room holding still, waiting for something to begin. Unaware that what was about to happen would linger in memory long after the last note faded, her heart beat steadily now. A calm rhythm beneath the surface of nerves and anticipation. She felt the connection between herself and the piano, a silent conversation that needed no words. This was the moment she had been waiting for. A moment suspended between preparation and performance, between expectation and revelation. And as she pressed the first key, the sound rang clear and true. The room leaned forward without realizing it, the audience drawn in by the honesty of the tone, the precision of the touch. The journey had begun, and nothing would ever feel quite the same again.